Hello, dear listener, and welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands, your very favorite podcast. I am Connor Rebush, your host. With me, as always, is Phil McKenzie, back in... I almost did it again. I almost said back in the UKKK. Back in the United Kingdom, having enjoyed his trip to the illustrious United States of America. And, boy... good timing, Phil, because we have an absolutely sensational lineup of fights to talk about this week. We're finally back on the UFC schedule. How terrible it was, wasn't it, to have the freedom to just talk about topics that are at will? Now, we are blessedly forced to discuss the main event and a couple of the undercard fights from UFC Moncton, which is in New Brunswick, Canada, for those who, like me, did not know that until checking the Wikipedia page. That main event is light heavyweight contenders bout between Volkan Oezdemir and Anthony Smith, a fight which can both be advertised by the extremely quick knockouts both men have achieved in the UFC, but also by pointing out that neither of them has, like, a quality win, except for Oezdemir beating OSB. All of their wins feel like they have tons of asterisks appended to them. They both have very confusing games that seem really, really lacking in a lot of areas. But I think that's kind of the interesting angle on this fight, is what you can get away with at light heavyweight and how the game changes with the worsening competition and the heavier hands. So, Phil, while I went through that spiel, have you managed to wrap your head around this matchup at all?
I think what I've realized about it is that I was thinking maybe this was the light heavyweight matchup, the archetype, but I've realized it's actually the dark mirror of the light heavyweight matchups, because normally in light heavyweight, you have people who look good, but then have a single crippling flaw that will always keep them from realizing their potential until you're so jaded that you don't care anymore. So I speak obviously of Corey Anderson, but of many other fights as well. And these guys, I was thinking that maybe they were that, and then I've realized I think they're actually the opposite. They're not a functional game with a single crippling flaw. They're a collection of flaws which somehow manages to win anyway.
Yeah, they are not Corey Andersons. They are Nikita Krylevs. These are yeah. I think you're right. To varying degrees. So like. Let's kick the discussion about how these guys match up. And by the way, I guess before we jump in, I do want to say we're also going to talk about some undercard fights, namely the co-main event, Michael Johnson versus Artem Labeouf. And then we're also going to get into one that we just could not resist talking about, another light heavyweight fight. And boy, I hope one of the men in this matchup gets moved up to the main event after an injury at the weigh-ins or something. But that's Gian Villante versus Ed Herrmann, which is a tragedy and a comedy all rolled up into one. So we will at least get to those fights after this. But I feel like maybe the best way, Phil, to get into understanding Oezdemir Smith would be to present what the central premise of the fight seems to be. And to do that, I think you have to go to the few things you can say for certain about either man. So here's what I feel I can say for certain that actually sums up a style in this matchup. Volkan Oezdemir feels to me, though I have not seen enough of it to be 100% certain, but he feels to me like a fast starter who verges on being a front runner. He had a difficulty down the stretch with Ovince St. Preux, who looked particularly terrible and flat that night. But OSP couldn't really do enough to really make Oezdemir look like a front runner. Daniel Cormier certainly did, but that's Daniel Cormier. And therein lies the problem. Is like, it doesn't really take that much of an achievement at light heavyweight to vault you right into title contention. So there's still a lot that we don't know about how either of these guys can be tested, what unseen weaknesses they may have. But that seems like what I know about this matchup, or about Volkan Oezdemir, that he is a fast starter with heavy hands, and that's kind of it. And he will get worse down the stretch. And conversely, I feel that Anthony Smith is a far less self-confident Derek Lewis, who has essentially learned, after a shockingly long career, most of which he spent fighting like a maniac until getting very, very tired and then frequently losing, he has learned over time to just do less. Doesn't seem to have really doesn't seem to have added any elements or techniques to his game since then. None that I can tell. But has learned to do less and wait for the opportunity to knock his opponent out. And being at light heavyweight, those opportunities have presented themselves very, very quickly recently. But I get the feeling that in this matchup, Smith's chances, in a 5-round matchup, I should remind you, Smith's chances will improve as the fight goes on, whereas Oezdemir's will decrease. And that's all that I feel like I kind of know.
Yeah, so I mean, these two they're oddly similar in some ways. I mean, they're both characterized as being weird finishes. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of that is that they're both just pretty accurate punches. Both in there, I mean, Smith is he's historically fought at a variety of different weight classes. So he's a lot of them smaller than light heavyweight, and that's given him some useful tricks, which is namely that he's used to people being much faster and, frankly, technically more skilled than they are at light heavyweight. But it's also meant that he is a long fighter who actually tries to fight long. Mm-hmm. So he has a reasonably decent jab, a front kick, and so on. So, and I think that's really like, and he's, as I said, he's used to smaller, faster men. So he's pretty good at putting his punches on people. Mm-hmm. If you watch the Shogun finish, it's not just him obliterating a faded fat Shogun, although it is that. It's him basically hitting Shogun at will with counters moving backwards. Mm-hmm. It's reasonably impressive, but also, enabled by the fact that Shogun is incredibly slow now.
Always the context comes back to spoil your achievements at 205.
Yeah. So, and the other thing is that they're both actually pretty good in the clinch. Mm-hmm. And by good, I don't mean necessarily in they are ironclad defensive wrestlers or particularly, but they are just offensively dangerous.
They both like to clinch, clearly.
Yeah.
And they both like to throw shots there. Oezdemir, it is weird because I remember when Oezdemir first came to the UFC, and that fool, Dr. Patrick Wyman, I believe, characterized him as like a fairly technical striker, and I've never been able to see that. His game looks really weird to me, dude. It looks.
I mean, we were talking about this beforehand. Is that he is nominally a hoofed-trained kickboxer, right. And he looks nothing like any of them. Look at the changes. The way he stands, the way he throws, it's completely.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think who he reminds me of.
Michael Johnson is maybe the best comparison of like a sort of loose, but even Michael Johnson has flashes of
just stands and fights in a very different way. Fights in a much more classical kickboxing stance.
Yeah.
Oezdemir he's primarily a boxer. He strikes more like, he strikes like? He strikes kind of like Ben Rothwell.
Oh. There's something to that.
He tends to come over the top with the right hand and the left hook. He just doesn't strike like anyone from that gym.
Yeah. It is a weird game. And he was even like that in his kickboxing career as well. He had this sort of bizarre winging hook game that would lead to the clinch. I will say, for a big man who doesn't look that athletic, he's actually a shockingly good kicker. He's has quite nice kicking technique. And he can do the Dutch thing, like put his hands together, finish with a low kick, the standard tactic. But mostly I think he is a left-handed puncher. That's like where his bread is buttered, is all about the left hook. And you could see him forcing that quite a bit against Daniel Cormier, though it's hard to blame him because you go from fighting light heavyweights to having to fight Daniel Cormier. It happens.
Yeah, that seems to be his primary trick, is a sort of dipping right hand, and then he comes with the left hook counter when the opponent tries to come back on him.
So will that work immediately against Anthony Smith, who has almost no striking defense to speak of? Because it might.
I mean, this is the thing, I feel like Anthony Smith, and it's so difficult to say against Shogun, but I thought he did look defensively more sound, in that he didn't. Shogun has at least been a tricky offensive fighter in his late career. I mean, he did look notably bad, but he still hasn't been someone that you can just wait on. You know, he's been able to mix up his timing. He's been able to get to a lot of people, but he just couldn't get in on Smith. Like, Smith kept his hands up, moved back. He didn't allow Shogun to settle on a punch. But so, I mean, I think his defense and his accuracy have both improved, but they might, as I said, they may just be due to him fighting big, slow people, and he suddenly realized that actually not fighting like welterweights and middleweights who are just zipping around him and tiring him out, he's actually allowing himself to put his hands on people is a bit more effective. Yeah. But I think what you said about Oezdemir being able to kick, I think for me that's probably the key in this one. Because that Lombard fight against
Smith,
that Lombard fight of Anthony Smith, Lombard just kicked his leg repeatedly, and Lombard's issue was that even to kick Anthony Smith's lead leg, he was just in range to get punched all the time. So it was a big risk for him. But even then, he was able to do it a lot. A lot. Clean,
hard kicks. Like it did show off Anthony Smith's toughness, as most of his fights do.
Yeah. But, so, and that's the thing. Do I trust Oezdemir to have enough of a game plan to be able to just attack Anthony Smith's leg? I mean, maybe I do. I mean, or do we expect this to be like a terrible version of like Diaz Johnson? I guess,
the question is do you feel that Oezdemir, despite how weird his striking technique looks, does he share in common with the other hoofed fighters that secret, desperate insecurity? Because that's Anthony Smith's superpower, is that he is, I mean, this is a matchup between insecure man and, I don't know, the biggest mannequin at H&M. I don't know what's a good way to say.
This is the thing, is that Anthony Smith has clearly weaponized his insecurity, right? He's one of those. He's managed to do what the Diaz brothers did with it.
Yes.
And he's managed to change it from being something which absolutely crippled him earlier on in his career to being something that he can actually use to kind of drive himself forward.
And that's something that no Henry Hooft fighter has ever done. Their insecurities have all been an albatross around their necks. So, I mean, do you think that Oezdemir, like, to your point about him coming in with a game plan, is it possible he just comes in here redoubling, after the Cormier loss, the thought that his only way to win is to go in there and quickly try to knock the guy out? And is that how he loses? Like, it does seem possible, right? He just goes in there, he hits Anthony Smith a lot. That's even possible. And then suddenly realizes, like, now that he's tired and can only throw hooks and has run out of ideas, that Anthony Smith does in fact still have reach and hasn't expended that much energy. and can still put combinations of weird shit together. I don't know.
I mean, this is the thing: is that do I really trust Anthony Smith? I mean, I don't know if I really trust Anthony Smith to. I don't trust the direction his fights are going to go in.
No,
because nominally, yeah, he's going to be the one who starts slow and surges towards the end, but he's so weird.
Well, it's
like he's clearly gets in his own head so much, but I can't trust him to. I can't trust that like the weaponized insecurity that he has is actually as consistent as like a Diaz brothers, because he's clearly visibly very upset a lot of the time, and it's not like he hasn't freaked out and panicked and and imploded.
And that's also why I have a hard time trusting his improvements. The potential improvements that you have touched on, because I feel like we saw a minute of him fighting Shogun, and he did a lot of the right things, right? He took angles. He jabbed off of angles. Like, that is a fundamental boxing skill that many MMA fighters don't know. He settled into his stance, he fired a jab, and each time he did it, he would reposition himself. So he didn't really have to retreat, and he was keeping Shogun on the end of his reach. I have seen him do that for a minute at a time before, I saw him do it against Hector Lombard, a fight in which he otherwise looked absolutely terrible in a very Derek Lewis way. And I think it's worth pointing out for our listeners that I like the Diaz comparison, but I really feel like Derek Lewis is a strong parallel, because Anthony Smith's fights used to be defined by him imploding. Like, it's only now that I feel like I can confidently say I would favor him if this fight goes into the 3rd, 4th, and 5th rounds. But up to this point in his career, he's been the exact opposite. So, like, do I even trust him to win in the 4th and 5th rounds? Or is it possible that he could just collapse to his previous state? I do feel like he's figured it out, though, that he just needs to not do much. Like, it's that simple. So, like, that's the problem with saying he's improved in the Shogun fight, is I still don't know that I don't think, in fact, I do not expect that he can do what he did to Shogun for more than maybe a minute at a time without being classic Anthony Smith and gassing himself out. So what does that leave him with against Volkan Oezdemir?
Yeah, but then again, how hard does Oezdemir really hit? I mean, can he get Anthony Smith out of there? And if he can't, can he really be there for 5 rounds with him? I mean, he's not a particularly high-paced fighter, but this is the thing, like, Oezdemir does at least seem to be... He's very tough, and the last functional kickboxer that Smith was up against kind of punted his guts out in Thiago Santos. And, like, I just don't trust his kicking defense. Admittedly, Oezdemir is a incredibly weird version of a kickboxer, but he is still a kickboxer.
Yeah, true.
So, I mean, yeah, I just feel like, in general, if one guy starts fast and another guy tends to start slow, it's a big advantage for the guy who starts quickly. Like,
yeah.
So, in general, I don't know what I'm expecting to happen. Maybe like a second round TKO from Oezdemir, but I really can't imagine how this fight actually goes.
Yeah,
I just don't have an image of how it ends up.
I think a relatively early knockout for Oezdemir is maybe the most likely. Like, it is worth keeping in mind. Smith only has an inch of reach on Oezdemir. And I think his reach is one of the few things that occasionally makes him look like he has an effective fighting style. So he's not going to have that. And as much as Oezdemir feels like a front runner, I certainly don't think he's like along the lines of, say, an Andrew Sanchez, who had his way with Anthony Smith before characteristically collapsing and going up in flames. So
yeah, I have to say I would like to see Anthony Smith win, just because he's kind of weird and fun and at least more interesting for me to watch than
the mannequin.
But yeah,
how dare you? But yeah, I tend to agree with everything. Still, I think Oezdemir knockout rounds 1 or 2 sounds about right. Mm-hmm. If that doesn't happen, I will be celebrating because it becomes more and more likely, I think, that Smith finds some way to win.
Shout-outs to Lionheart, the man who was called Lionheart despite imploding in most of his fights for his early career and has a lion tattoo on the wrong side of his chest. Awesome.
Forgot about that. All right, well, that's your main event, folks. I am genuinely intrigued by this, I have to say. I know there's been a hint of irony to much of this analysis, but it's weird in a very compelling way to me. This is a real light heavyweight style fight. Real light heavyweight hours going on here. So that'll be coming up this weekend, again in Moncton, New Brunswick, Canada. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we are going to get into some of the undercard here. Again, Mike Johnson versus Artem Labeouf, and John Villante versus Ed Herrmann, and maybe something else as well. And then we'll probably get to a topic suggested by one of our patrons after this. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. Okay, welcome back to Heavy Hands. Enough hemming and hawing about what the hell these fights are. Let's go ahead and get into discussing them. The co-main event is the first one we should touch on, and it is one of the easier stylistic matchups, I think, to suss out. Again, that's Michael Johnson versus Artem Labeouf. Phil, how are you predicting Artem Labeouf will win this fight?
Big left hand. You know, he's got that McGregor left.
Yeah. If there's one guy in this fight who is characterized by their ability to knock someone out with their left hand, it's definitely Artem Labeouf.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, we pretty much covered it.
Yeah, that's it. All right, so moving on. Andre Sukumtat versus Jonathan Martin. No, yeah, like what is this? What are the dynamics of this matchup? Can you lay it out for us, Phil?
Artem Labeouf is not very athletic and not very good, but is incredibly tough and determined and actually sticks to game plans pretty well.
Yeah, he's kind of good, isn't he?
Yeah. He's
better than he seems like he should be. He's not. He's relatively technical as a striker. He essentially has like the same set of tools as a Conor McGregor.
Yep.
But like with a much less capable frame. He literally has the opposite of Conor McGregor's reach. But he does have a lot of the same moves that McGregor has. So a lot of like the preloaded counters. Labeouf is quite effective with those. If you throw something that he slips to his right and the punch slides over his left shoulder, he doesn't have to think to know to come back with the left hand. Or I should mirror that, but he doesn't have to think to come back with the counter off the slip, so on and so forth. It's worth remembering he was very effective. Much more effective than he should have been against Cub Swanson. Was quite competitive, despite losing every round. And truly getting his ass beaten and absorbing a lot of punishment. But he did compete, and I think that is by virtue of having some good rote tricks that he doesn't have to think about. They just happen in exchanges. That's, to me, isn't that his only window into this matchup? Like, otherwise, he's just much, much slower than Michael Johnson, isn't he?
Yeah. So, Michael Johnson is... He is, you know, we talked about it a bit when we were talking about Volkan. He is a classic insecure hoofed fighter who will start to panic and freak out if things start going south.
Yeah.
But forgiven forgiving or even like tough but not overwhelming style matchups, Johnson does not go off the rails that much. And as you mentioned, he is bigger, he's taller, he has more reach, he is infinitely faster, he hits harder. Lobov is possibly tougher, but Johnson himself actually takes a hell of a shot.
Yeah, he really does. A lot of times you see fighters with like long reach, and then they rarely fight people who can get past the end of their reach. And so when it does happen, they panic, and that's when they start to fall apart. And Johnson has that with, like, by virtue of his speed and his power. That the vast majority of people he fights, like, he does generally stick to something approaching a game plan pretty well. Because most of the time, his opponents have to respect his speed and his power. They don't want to walk into the pocket and exchange with him. They back off when he throws, and he starts countering them really hard from the get-go. Like, immediately he has triggers and starts firing on them. So the question is, like, is Artem Lobov at all capable of either being tough enough or well prepared enough for this matchup that he can pressure Michael Johnson and get him to react badly? Or is Michael Johnson just going to look like the good version of Michael Johnson the whole time?
Yeah, so I think there's two... I think in general it's hard to think of a way in which Lobov really wins this fight. I mean, just because I'm not sure what functional tools he has. I think he's really picked up on that leg kick, the one that he used in that god awful Diaz McGregor clone fight. Chris Avila, was it?
Yes. Yeah.
But he's picked up a nice kind of trick of, punting the other guy's lead leg out of the way and then coming with the right hook and then waiting and then responding with that little pull counter. Mm-hmm. So he's developed a useful little game that sort of forces people to get into exchanges with him. But other than that, I just think that even if he pulls a fast-paced kind of brawl out of Johnson, like, does he win that?
Yeah. Like, yeah. The problem is that as much as Johnson, for being super insecure, feels like a fragile fighter, you're right. Like, he's very, very tough. And his version of going off the rails is to start fighting crazily. And that does seem like that, like in a Jose Aldo kind of way, will probably work against Artem Lobov. Like, all you have to do is say, okay, now he's now getting the chance to exchange with me. As Michael Johnson, I should start exchanging with him. And I'll probably win those.
Yeah, I mean, as far as kickboxing, I mean, and this is basically going to be a pure kickboxing match. Lobov will clinch up with people, but he's not really much of a takedown threat.
No.
So
Johnson is if we're talking, a very good first layer takedown defender.
Yeah. If we're talking if we're talking pure kickboxing matches, then Michael Johnson has beaten Melvin Gillard, Edson Barboza, Dustin Poirier, and Tony Ferguson, and the people he's lost to have been like, and he probably beat Beneil Dariush too, let's be honest. And the people he's lost to are like Nate Diaz and Justin Gaethje.
Yeah, either incredibly aggressive, incredibly durable.
Artem Lobov's best win in general is Teruto Ishihara.
Ooh, is that true? I think that's true.
Let's have a look. Yes, by some measure.
Maybe Shea Walsh. He had a surprise knockout over Shea Walsh in 2012.
Okay. Maybe
that's on par with Ishihara. Maybe. Probably not. Yeah, it's probably Ishihara. So yeah. I mean, it feels like a foregone conclusion. Michael Johnson is just a much faster, more dangerous version of the kind of fighter Artem Lobov is, who, I don't know, being unshakable if you're Artem Lobov. Like, I don't see how far that can take you when it all seems to come back to you have to exchange with this guy to beat him, and exchanging with him is exactly how he beats you. So, Michael Johnson by KO or decision? I'm going to say decision, in fact.
I'm going to say decision. I mean, his last fight against Miles Jury was a little concerning because it illustrated exactly the problems that we saw that he might have at featherweight. And that without his speed advantage, he's just no longer hitting quite as accurately.
Yeah. I mean, he still has a speed advantage, certainly over the likes of Artem Labeouf, but it's lessened at 145 for sure.
Yeah, he had to fight, and he fought. I mean, to his credit, he fought a much more controlled fight than I thought he would. As a matter of fact, and I thought things like his cross looked a lot better. He was bowling it much less, and he was actually kind of drawing a straight line with it. I mean, it was still a very close nip-tuck fight, and it did show that perhaps he might just not be that kind of athletic force who's able to blow contenders out of the water like he did against Poirier down at featherweight. But yeah, he's just got major technical advantages on one end if he chooses to fight one way, and just physical advantages in terms of power and speed on the other one.
Yep, both the technique and the athleticism, whichever one he happens to choose to use or is forced to fall into, it feels like he will still end up winning. Yep. So let's move on then to the one we know you've all been waiting for. This is really a stunt choice to analyze if the matchup can be analyzed. But Phil, this is right up our alley, isn't it? Gian Villante versus Ed Herrmann is hilarious, tragic. It really runs the gamut of all the emotions you can get out of a meaningless prize fight.
Ed Herrmann may be, pound for pound, the most foot-slow ginger to ever step foot in the UFC.
Yeah, he and Evan Dunham,
with the possible exception of our beloved
Pat Healy.
Pat Healy, yeah.
Yeah, is Evan Dunham a ginger? He's kind of
his
blonde.
Soul.
In his
soul, he is.
I mean, yeah. Ed Herrmann is now, like, even though he should have retired long before Evan Dunham finally did, he is now officially by far the slowest fighter in the UFC, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, no, he is. There is no like or exception to that.
So he is a reasonably well-rounded fighter. He is someone who can submit, who's pretty strong in the clinch. He's a functional kickboxer. It's just all being played back at 75% speed.
I'm not even sure it's at 75% anymore. He's 38 years old, Phil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Less than 75%. And then we have Gian Villante, who is a robot. Or a brobot, I guess, would make more sense.
That's upsetting.
And then he will just plod forward and show his manliness and throw a big right hand, and maybe it will connect. And he will also throw in an unprotected leg kick, and that is it. Gian Villante will do that forever.
I cannot get over brobot. It's really apt. Yes. Good analysis, my friend. I think you covered all the key dynamics in this matchup. Gian Villante, aka Chris Weidman's id, cannot learn. He cannot change. His corner spends every single fight of his screaming at him to do things that either they have not prepared him to do, or he has just refused to absorb despite their efforts. Namely, like moving his head and protecting himself and, like doing things differently, like using his jab and not always having to throw the 1, 2, 3 and then occasionally a naked low kick. I mean, realistically, he's going to hit really hard. He's super tough. He's really big. And his own shocking slowness is going to be... He's going to look lightning quick in comparison to Ed Herrmann for the first time in Gian Villante's career. So
yeah,
it's an obvious pick for Villante, I think. How incredible would it be, though, Phil? Like, what will you do in gratitude if Ed Herrmann wins this fight? I think I'll
down money on Derek Lewis, yeah. I would be very happy. I remember being pretty impressed when he took out Tim Boach. That was very shocking to me. But yeah, I mean, he's a smarter fighter than Volante. I mean, wait a minute, that's not saying anything, is it?
I do want to say though, like, just on that point, sorry to cut you off, but I like Ed Herrmann a lot. Like, I love his game. It's very functional. It makes a lot of sense, and he can do a lot of things very well. I just want to say that he's just really old
I mean, this
now.
Is the thing. He is a good fighter, but like I said, it doesn't matter if you. It sort of doesn't matter how well the pieces of your game fit together if you fight like you're underwater.
Yeah.
So he might be able to see the big right hand coming from Villante fairly quickly, but that doesn't mean he can move out of the way of it.
Yeah.
And Villante and Herrmann's comparative well-roundedness won't really make much of a difference because Villante, for all his other flaws, is also very hard to take down and very hard to force into anything but the incredibly silly kickboxing match he always wants against everyone. I mean, let's not forget like him against Patrick Cummins. He managed to force Patrick Cummins into an awful, awful kickboxing match, which Villante then lost.
Yeah, let's not forget that. That is very important to remember. Also important to remember, like, because he lost that fight, the implication there is that he failed to knock Patrick Cummins out. So, like, it is possible he may fail to knock Ed Herrmann out. Nothing is outside the realm of possibility here.
Yeah, I mean, if Ed Herrmann kind of figures out where the, like, here be dragons parts are in the cage, where he can just plod through and Villante's fists will never land there, then if he can just figure that out within the first round without getting knocked out, then sure.
Yeah, the trick is to stand not directly in front of John Villante. That'll be the real challenge, though. Okay.
Amazing.
Well, John Villante is probably going to very depressingly and predictably knock Ed Herrmann out. This is what light heavyweight is for. Are there any other fights in this card that you want to touch on before we wrap it up, Phil?
I think
there are a couple of interesting.
Chris Fishgold should be a lot of fun. I think that's probably the most well matched and kind of technically interesting fight. Chris Fishgold, Cage Warriors champion from the UK, and Calvin Cater, obviously, very skilled fighter out of Boston. So I think that should be. I think it's probably Cater might just be a little too much for Fishgold at this point. Fishgold hasn't really fought any strikers quite as technical as him, but it should be a lot of fun. They're both very good in multiple areas, and they're both reasonably athletic. And yeah, that's probably, I think, the most interesting fight on the card for me.
I'm particular to the featured prelim, which is Nordine Taleb versus Shawn Strickland. Because I really like Shawn Strickland for no particular reason, I guess. But I think it's actually like a really interesting style matchup. I still think very fondly, Phil, about Strickland's fight with Tom Breeze.
Yep.
Which I really enjoyed, and have watched far more times than is necessary or right. But I really enjoy matchups like that in MMA, I think, when two technical... sort of like defensively responsible, thoughtful, long-range strikers have a matchup with each other. Two guys who are used to using their reach against their opponents, but also don't just like happily rely on it. They will build off of what's working, what isn't working, and adapt. And I think both Taleb and Strickland can do that quite well. And they both have really long arms. And so I am expecting a pretty fascinating kickboxing match, actually, between them. Especially now that it does feel like things have been evened out. Strickland was obliterated by Zaleski dos Santos in his last fight, but also Taleb was humiliatingly obliterated by Claudio Silva in his last fight. So I'm on board for that one. Our boy,
should be a lot of fun.
Our boy Nasrat Hakparast is fighting Thibault Gouti for no reason, and that is essentially all there is to really care about on this card. So
yep, I'm excited. I want to see Hack pressed again, but it's a bit of a shame that it's a clear step down from his last fight. So yeah.
Although maybe that's a good thing, right? Like we don't. Hack press seems like the kind of fighter they threw him in there against Held, a Marcin Held, and he almost won. And then they made the wise choice of giving him a slight step back. I don't know if they even thought they were giving him a step back, but he fought a prospect. And now he gets another step back, which is not the usual way it goes, but I'm kind of on board for that. Like, I want to see a young Nasrat Haqparast who is not only technically improving, as he clearly did in his last fight, but also brimming with the confidence that comes from destroying men like Thibaut Gouti. So I'm cool with it. I'm sure he'll get something big after this. He's still very young. He doesn't need to be rushed.
Yep.
All right. Well, that's UFC Moncton. Truly a fascinating card. Not for maybe all of the reasons that you would like a card to be, but this is also the benefit of having a few weeks off. I do feel like I have the willpower to care about what happens in the bizarre main event, or to care about the slim possibility that Artem Labeouf could finally crack Michael Johnson's granite chin. It's a weird card, but in an interesting way. So that's that. When we come back, we are going to get into a segment topic suggested by one of our patrons, and I may as well tease what that's going to be now. We're going to talk about scrambling, courtesy of a patron by the name of Glenn. We are going to talk about how scrambling works, what makes fighters effective in scrambles and wild exchanges. After this. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. You can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. All right, welcome back to Heavy Hands, segment 3 here, and as promised, we are covering a topic suggested by one of our patrons. Quite an interesting topic, I think. I'm going to struggle my way through this, trying to condense it, because you maniacs who support this show just love to send in paragraphs and paragraphs as your topic/question suggestions. But I appreciate that, because as listeners of the show, you may know I also have a hard time shutting up. So Glenn, one of our patrons, he wants us to talk about this. Scrambles. I'm interested, he says, in the transitions and scrambles, that chaotic element where there are many choices available to both fighters and a need to act quickly. Why are some fighters better at it than others? Do people train for specific elements of transition? Or do they have an intuitive sense and tactical mastery? Which fighters do well by trying to keep it predictable? Who deliberately tries to make it chaotic, etc., etc. So we're talking about scrambling, and I would say beyond scrambling in the sense we usually think of it in MMA, like flopping around on the ground, I would also say that exchanging punches on the feet, welcoming exchanges, is the striker's version of a scrambly grappler. So I think that is there is a stylistic distinction to be made here, where you can say right from the get-go, certain fighters will be more likely to trade punches and or scramble, and other fighters will be more likely to avoid those kinds of situations whenever possible. So let's start off with why some fighters are better at it than others, because that's really the meat of this question, I think, Phil. And you have like a sort of a good structure for this idea, I think.
Well, I mean, in terms of why some fighters are good at it, are better at it than others, I'm not sure if there's much of an explanation for that, other than that some fighters are just profoundly uncomfortable in certain positions. Because I think Glenn mentioned like Melvin Gillard as an example. I think there are some, MMA is a very wide, has very wide range of skills, and I think that are required, and there are just some fighters which are just never comfortable in a particular realm. Like, I think Melvin Gillard, for example, always felt incredibly panicked the minute he got down and felt like he had to burst back to his feet and ended up getting himself submitted. In terms of being good at it, I think it's more of an interesting in how people are good at something like that. It's more of an interesting approach, because I think composure, as he mentioned, this is something which is very important. But composure also has kind of two different elements to it, because if we think of how good fighters, skilled fighters respond to given situations, like scrambles, like, chaos, which is one of the inherent parts of a fight. There's two sort of basic philosophies you can approach it from. They can be either high percentage or they can be predictive. And these are rarely, this is rarely something which I think people do both of.
They tend to pick one or the other.
You tend to be very clearly philosophically inclined towards one or the other. So high percentage people will tend to do what is right. They will tend to do what is correct within a given situation that often reduces their opponent's options down to a bare minimum. And so, I mean, if we think of fighters like this, it is Jose Aldo, GSP. These kind of guys have very stripped down, basic, functional games, which they would do the most high percentage, take the most high percentage opportunity almost every time, particularly in grappling situations. If you think of how Jose Aldo fights takedowns, he feeds the leg, he limp legs, turns around, fights the hands, stiff arms, push back, reset. It's all exactly, it's all done incredibly, not necessarily in a rote way, but just very quickly executed.
He has a specific process that not only, he doesn't just get out of takedowns, he turns every takedown attempt into the same escape. He has developed a style of wrestling that is about forcing the opponent to attack the one kind of takedown he feels most comfortable escaping from.
Yep. Or, GSP's ground game, where we think about, he's basically just stacks them and then traps a leg, pins the opponent, and then goes for a knee slide pass. He would have a very, very simple batch of options that he would go to. And the same thing was true if GSP was on his back as well. He would just go for he would just sweep or go for a scissors guard, and he would just get back up very, very quickly. So the opposite of this is guys like Tony Ferguson and Anthony Pettis.
May I also suggest, because it did occur to me when we were talking about this before, that GSP and Aldo are the examples of, it does seem to imply that one of these is better than the other. I don't really think that's the case, because fighting doesn't always work like that. May I suggest that maybe Fedor Emelianenko is one of the more scrambly great fighters of all time, who really relies on, do you feel like Fedor is a predictor or a?
I don't know. The thing is that, so the thing about being a predictive fighter is, this a high percentage fighter does not generally attempt to predict what's going to happen to them. I think a predictive fighter is trying to read you at almost all times. And this means that, whilst this kind of seems like it's something which is, instinctively from a probabilistic standpoint, you might be thinking, this is low percentage. Why is this guy going for it? The thing is that it allows them to read situations and go for very hard counters to them. And so I think Fedor's probably a good example of one of those guys. He was someone who was very quick at being able to realize what when a strike would force someone, when his right hand would force someone into his left hook. He was very quick at being able to realize how he could force people from one situation into the other, and very quick at, opportunistically attacking things like submissions.
And maybe Demetrius Johnson is that way too, despite being a very technical fighter. He is also very much it's more of a rapid decision-making tree. that he goes through when he's fighting than it is like GSP sticking to the fundamentals so perfectly that you just can't figure out a way around them.
Yeah, I mean, DJ, I think, he's probably one of the closest things to being a combination of the two, right?
The rare all-terrain fighter.
Yeah.
It occurs to me, Phil, that we have sort of backdoored our way into a discussion of strategy versus tactics, which is...
I mean, because that's basically what it is. It's long-term prediction it's sort of long-term prediction versus short-term prediction.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, in both cases, it needs a lot of composure, and it needs composure and commitment. And it, because for the predictors, for your Anthony Pettis and your Tony Fergusons and so on, you need to think about a great deal of things very, very quickly. Mm-hmm. This is why, they get a lot of praise for being things like creative, is that they are, and you have to have like a lot of possibilities flowing through your mind at all times in order to do that. A lot of the time, a sort of high percentage person will literally be trying not to think about a lot of the things going on in a fight because they don't, because they're trying to focus only on the most important things. Mm-hmm. Whereas this is being able to predict things in the short term allows you to, as I said, to suddenly bring out very hard counters to them. So the classic example for me is always Charles Oliveira against Anthony Pettis, where the matchup has been described by the fight that we've seen as being striker versus grappler broadly, is that Pettis has been hurting Oliveira on the feet with body kicks, but Oliveira is a better wrestler and a better top position player, and so they have a scramble, and then Pettis is getting to his feet, and then Oliveira just reshoots on him from his knees.
Yeah, without even thinking.
Just guillotines him.
Yeah,
because he's not thinking like long-term striker versus grappler, anything like this. He's just thinking,
there's his neck.
He's just thinking, I know what this guy's going to do, and I can kill him for it. Yeah, and he does instantly.
Yeah, and I like the other example that you brought up earlier. Of the other end of that spectrum is somebody like Floyd Mayweather, who I think is an even better example of just how to understand. Like, if you do understand this as two fundamentally opposed ways of thinking about fighting, is that Mayweather is he embodies one of my favorite terms to use in this show, which is wife beating. No, he embodies. People know I love to talk about domestic abuse. No, he embodies systematic fighting, where it really is like, this is the point that you made earlier. I do want to give you credit for this, but he has found a way of taking the decision making out of the fight because his defense is so sound. And in boxing in particular, like, sound defense means like having a relatively limited array of options that you can sort of limitlessly cycle through. And it becomes comparatively, like, rather than fighting in a reckless exchange, it's comparatively much easier for these guys to just stack the same moves on top of each other, one after the other, until the other guy gets tired of throwing. So, like, when I slip left, I know from that position I can either pull my head back, I can bend my knees and dip down or roll under, or I can slip back to the right and get behind my shoulder. I have a limited array of options from every position, and I have trained myself rigorously to instinctively turn to those options when I feel threatened in a certain sort of zone or sector, right? He's throwing at the lower right side of my body. I know what my responses are for that. And so it allows him, that frees him to think of the fight strategically. It frees him to make much longer term predictions. And actually, like, they're often in Mayweather's fights, you'll find, like, he seems to be the only, what was you brought up this quote from Andre Berto once upon a time, Phil, where, what did Berto say when he fought him? He was like, he had a moment like halfway through the fight.
What did he say?
He had a moment, I think, like several rounds in, where he was like, nothing happened. And it's been like 9 rounds. And I've lost them all. Like, it took him ages to be like, wait a minute, he's winning constantly. And yet it doesn't feel like we've been doing anything. It feels like we've barely been sparring.
All he was doing is that he was just like, he was just describing. He just looks around, and then he's not doing anything. He's fainting, and then he won't do anything, and like eventually you just come in and then he'll hit you with one shot, and then he goes back and he just starts fainting, and like, wait a minute, the round's over.
Yeah, suddenly the fight's over. So like that to me is a great example of the opposite way of thinking about this, where like really I think somebody like Floyd does embody the pursuit of a certain ideal, which is to not have to think about the tactics of fighting in the moment, to just have set responses that you automatically go to. And that frees you to think about the big picture, which is something that, like, being a super scrambly fighter actively makes hard to do. It's very, very difficult. I don't think this is hard to express, but like, it's crazy how the moment you get hit in the face, things change. The way that you're viewing everything changes. You start living very much in the moment and obsessing over certain details and letting other things completely slide out of your awareness. So it's fascinating to think of, like, some fighters just swim in that kind of environment. But the way to beat that is to just not have to just take yourself out of the moment entirely by taking care of all of the chaotic elements. So, are there any other aspects to this topic? Let's see.
I don't think so. I think it is basically just, boring things like composure and skill and training and so on. But I think underneath those, there's the idea of, there's a basic philosophy to it. That, do I try and read the other guy, or do I try and read, do I try and read the sport, in a more like in a broader way? It does come down to composure, which is something Glenn mentions, but I think it comes down to, like, it is a stylistic question, which means it's a personality question. We mentioned Michael Johnson and Anthony Smith's raging insecurities earlier. I want to emphasize here to end this topic that insecurity is built into fighting. Like, that is, I think, the main thing that elevates fighting beyond most other sports, is that you are actively made to feel insecure. You are insecure because another guy is trying to knock you out and might do it at any moment. So like, it's really a matter of how do you either harness or rein in your insecurity, and what kind of fighting style does that result in? And certain guys are insecure. They feel insecure with the thought of having to make quick decisions, which is like, I can relate to that based on what I just explained. It becomes really hard to make quick decisions once you're actually thrown into an exchange or a scramble. And certain guys are insecure with the idea of trying to do everything perfectly all the time, I think, and having to play with color within the lines nonstop. So like, it's a matter of how you either harness or rein that kind of stuff in. So it's not a matter of just, like, both styles require composure. Composure is utterly important in fighting because you have to hide that insecurity, but it's a matter of where you find your composure. And I think it's not wrong or right to find composure, either being a wild, unpredictable scrambler or a really boring, systematic fighter, the two extremes. So thank you, Glenn, for that topic. Very interesting. And I hope you guys listening enjoyed that. And that pretty much wraps up all we have to talk about today. Looking forward once again to UFC Moncton. After that, do we have any break at all before? No, we do not. After that, my God, the time will have come already. Derek Lewis versus Daniel Cormier is almost upon us. So very, very excited for next week's episode. I hope you guys are as hyped for that as I am, and I'm sure as much as Phil is. Phil, are you extremely hyped for Derek Lewis's inevitable taking of the UFC heavyweight strap? It is. I mean, it's going to be incredible. Whatever happens, this is some kind of apotheosis. Like, this is some kind of apex of the dumbness of two divisions meeting, like the daddest man on the planet against the Black Beast. Like, what more could you ask for?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so fucking hyped. And the rest of the card is whatever, but truly it doesn't matter. There are, in fact, some other good fights in here, but we'll get to that next week. Before we go, do you have anything to plug, Phil? You doing a preview with the old David?
Yep. So we're going to be previewing. I think we're just doing one this
David.
week. We're not going to be previewing Johnson Labeouf, unfortunately. So, if you want to read more of my incredibly confused thoughts on Oezdemir Smith,
Yeah.
And hope David's, which will hopefully be a bit more clear than mine, then check that out.
Knowing the tenor of the whole discussion we had before we actually began recording today, I am really interested to see how, if you will have figured anything out any more than you understand it now by the time that article publishes. Will you have gained any kind of better grasp of Smith Oezdemir? Only time will tell. As for me, I promised a week ago a Derek Lewis article. That will be coming out this week. So keep your eyes peeled for how to fight like Derek Lewis in advanced preparation of his shot at the heavyweight title. It's going to be a somewhat humorous take on the game of Derek Lewis, which should be truly dysfunctional and should not work for anyone, and maddeningly works almost all of the time. So sort of an examination of the heavyweight division and one of its most iconic styles right there. Look forward to that. And again, next week, UFC 230 will be upon us very, very soon. So until then, find us on social media with your comments, your questions, your yada, yada, yada. I am at Boxing Bush on Twitter. That's BUSCH. Phil is at Evil Greg Jackson. And until next week, if you came here today for the finer points of face punching, bitch, you know you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.